Hi, everyone. Um, this is a brief overview on Chapter 2. And Chapter 2 is really about thinking about justice and what does justice mean. For a lot of us, when we were asked, what does justice mean? We probably go, stumble, stammer a bit, and then we maybe come up with an idea of what justice is. To me, that means that most people haven't really thought a lot about justice. And I hope as you move through this chapter that you do have an opportunity to really think about justice, what it means, and what it means to you. There, of course, have been philosophers and legal theorists who, for centuries, have been thinking about and asking the question, what is justice? What is just? And of course, it's easy to use a dictionary definition, but it's so much more complex than that. In fact, one of the philosophers that's discussed at some length is Aristotle. And Aristotle's idea of justice was to treat equals equally and unequals unequally, which sounds great until you start asking the question, well, wait a minute, who gets to decide? Who gets to make the decision? And how do they, what ways do they decide what is relevant? Because what a relevant difference is to somebody like me might not be a relevant difference to somebody like you. And so, of course, if you are a person with money, power, resources, opportunities, and privileges, then you probably think it's a great idea because 9 times out of 10, you're going to be the one making the decision about what are relevant differences. If you're someone who comes from a historically marginalized background, you probably are going to think, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like such a great idea because historically those individuals have not had the opportunity to decide what relevant differences are. So, what I want you to consider then is how is the system set up in such a way that certain kinds of people get to decide what is relevant? And so I gave you the paper assignment about Aristotle's idea and asked you to write about his idea and to think about it. And so I hope that that gives you the opportunity to really grapple with the question of what is just. There's also a discussion in the text about um, let's see, also about distributive justice. And distributive justice is really focused on the idea of if there aren't any relevant differences, then resources should be distributed equally. Of course, if there are relevant differences, then that would require an unequal distribution. And this sounds pretty good, right? Because you think, well, okay, if everybody needs $20,000 a year to live, I know that's pretty simple, then the people who don't have 20,000, maybe only have 10, should maybe be given $10,000 to live, an extra 10,000 so that they have the 20 that everybody else has. That sounds like a good idea. But not everybody's going to think that's a relevant difference. And so that may not actually happen. In fact, it generally doesn't happen because people think, well, the relevant difference is how hard you try. If you don't try hard enough, then and you don't have enough money, then well, that's your fault. Or if you don't go to school, which means that you're not making enough money, well, then that's too bad for you because that's a relevant difference to them that you didn't work hard enough or you didn't go to school. And so they may decide, well, then we don't really need to give you the extra 10,000 so that you can live at a comfortable level. You just have to figure out how to live on $10,000 a year. There's also a discussion about retributive justice. And retributive justice is really focused on how a society's system of justice, how it is used to determine guilt or innocence. Okay, so for example, in the United States, we pride ourselves on our due process rights, and these are enumerated, of course, in the Bill of Rights. And there are many Supreme Court decisions that have sought to flesh out more what those rights are. And we tend to look in a negative way at countries where there are very few due process rights. And so we like to pat ourselves on the shoulder and say, yes, this is great. Um, Everybody gets due process rights. And while that maybe sounds great, consider this. The idea that um, all, if you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Um, well, that sounds great. We can pat ourselves on the back. Yay, we give everybody, we appoint an attorney to represent people who can't afford one. But the reality is this. Public defenders in most jurisdictions, including LA and Orange counties, they are so overworked that they don't really have the time to treat those cases in the same way that a private attorney does, because a private attorney doesn't have the large caseload and has more money, has money to hire private investigators to dig up dirt on people who are going to testify against you, has money to hire expert witnesses to try to refute what the state, meaning the DA's office, is going to argue about the evidence, has money to hire people to help with the case, to investigate and write all the documents up, etc. The public defender doesn't have those things, and so it's no surprise that many public defenders encourage people to plea bargain as opposed to going through the full process. And so it sounds good to say that we have all these due process rights, but maybe they don't always work the same for everyone. Also, there's a discussion about legal realism, which is a concept that's been around much more recently, maybe the last 40 years or so. And legal realism is really concerned with asking the question, what are the consequences of how laws are applied? And so one really good example of this, I think, is bail bonds, the bail bond system. You know how it works in the U.S. It is a process, or in California, sorry, and many other states use it too. Let's say somebody gets arrested, there's $50,000 bail the person can post. If you have $50,000, you post it with the court, and then you get to go home. You get to sleep in your own bed, go to work, have dinner with your friends and family. Your life goes on as the case is progressing through the system. If you don't have $50,000, then another option for you would be to go to a bail bonds person, or your family members to go to a bail bonds person. And the bail bonds person typically charges 10%, which would be $5,000 in this case. And you can either put that on a credit card, or you can put some money down and then finance the rest. But the reality is that for most people who use a bail bonds person, they end up paying more than the $5,000. And the bail bonds person, of course, will go and place the $50,000 with the court. But and assuming that your family member goes through the process and the case is resolved in whatever way, the bail bonds person gets the $50,000 back, but gets to keep all the money that they charged you. Because remember, the bail bonds person isn't doing this out of the goodness of his or her heart. This type of system overwhelmingly disadvantages working class and low income people. Now, the California State Legislature last fall passed a law that would abolish this practice and simply leave the decision about whether or not a person gets out of jail while the case is pending through the system, would leave it to judges. Judges would have the discretion to determine that. And of course, judges already have discretion to determine bail. This would simply say, this law simply would say, okay, judge, you decide whether a person should stay in jail because a person is a flight risk or is particularly dangerous to himself or to others, or you decide that this person isn't such a danger. It's a fairly low-level nonviolent crime. This person gets out pending the resolution of the case. And so, of course, the bail bonds individuals, people who run bail bond services in California are very much opposed to this. They are trying to convince Californians that this would be a terrible law if it goes into effect. They argue that there'd be a lot of dangerous people getting out of jail, and so they want California voters to vote to repeal this law. And there's likely going to be a ballot initiative on the November 2020 ballot. So I encourage you to read up on the issue, and if you are a registered voter or can register to vote, I encourage you to register to vote. And if you are registered, to participate in November 2020, not only on this issue, but of course on all the other issues, and we'll be voting for president as well. So that's a brief overview of Chapter 2, and I'll see you again next week for the overview of Chapter 3.